I often get asked by people who are undergrads or master's students in emergency management programs for recommendations on books they should be reading that they might not be assigned in their classes. If you fall into this very specific group of people, then the recommendations I am about to go through are for you. A couple of these books are like classic emergency management books that you've probably at least read some of in your courses. Others are a little bit more off people's radar. First book I have to recommend is actually two books. They are these. Both of these are called What is a Disaster? This one is edited by Quarantelli and Perry, and this one is edited just by Quarantelli. This one came out in 1998. This one came out in 2005. They are both edited volumes considering the question of what is a disaster. These are obviously books that are for an academic audience, that are for people who are studying disasters and want to spend a lot of time thinking about what we mean when we say disaster and the various components of a definition and the various theoretical perspectives that one can take when studying disasters. These are your classic back and forth academic chatter books. The authors are responding to each other in each of these volumes. I found both of these books really fascinating to read and really fundamental to my understanding of the emergence of the discipline of emergency management, but also disaster research more broadly. The next book I have is an absolute classic. If you are watching this video, I would be shocked if you hadn't already read this, but it is Disaster by Design by Dennis Milletti. This is obviously a classic in disaster research and emergency management research. There's definitely a lot of additional research that has come out since this book was written, and certain policies have changed a bit, but the overarching concepts that are in this book really hold up. It talks a lot about sustainability and mitigation, and there's certainly been additional conversation since this was written in 1999. If this were written today, there would be slightly more nuance, and maybe certain things might be worded differently, but overall this is a really good place to start. The next book I have to recommend is this one, Hurricane Andrew, Ethnicity, Gender, and the Sociology of Disasters by Peacock, Morrow, and Gladwin. I included this here because this is my favorite case study disaster book. This is the one that I find myself referencing the most. This is a good one to start with if you're new to emergency management and you're definitely thinking about going to grad school in emergency management. This is maybe a good kind of a transition to get into the like what is a disaster book and start getting used to reading about emergency management in an academic way. Again, it's important to remember that this book is taking a sociological perspective, which is going to be different than taking an emergency management perspective. Since a lot of emergency management research comes from sociologists and from a sociological perspective, better get used to reading that kind of stuff. So this is a good kind of intro to that. So in the same way that the last book was from a sociological perspective, this book is from an anthropological perspective. This is called Catastrophe and Culture, the Anthropology of Disaster. It is, again, an edited volume by Susanna Hoffman and Anthony Oliver Smith. I actually only very recently read this book. I think I had read a couple chapters of it printed out before, but I had never actually read the entire book. Anthropology is another discipline that has contributed to disaster research in a big way. So I think it's important to read about disasters from their perspective. I really like the layout of the book. It starts off just why should anthropologists be studying disasters, talks about theorizing disasters, historical disaster research, the popular framing of disasters in the media. It provides a few case studies for Exxon Valdez and Bhopal. I just thought it was a really good collection. I really liked the different chapter topics were all really interesting. I think it brings up a lot of the important issues in disaster research. Again, this is from an anthropological perspective, not an emergency management perspective. It's an important distinction to make, but nonetheless, I think this is really valuable and is another one that I can see myself citing a lot in the future. Like the Hurricane Andrew book, this is a good one for people who are kind of just starting out in grad school and kind of wanting to start learning about how to read an academic perspective of disasters. And last but certainly not least is the Handbook of Disaster Research. This is the obvious book that you should have if you study disasters. It covers the major topics in disaster research. This is a book that covers just about all the topics. I don't think I've ever actually read this cover to cover. Anytime I start researching a new area within emergency management, or I have to write a paper on a new area in emergency management, I pull this off the shelf, find the corresponding chapter, and start mining it for citations, which is, I kind of think, how most people use this. This is a really great resource when you're writing papers and need to find citations, or are looking for a starting point for a new subject that you may be interested in. This one is usually a little bit more money online, but it's well worth the price because you'll use it pretty frequently. So those are the books I find myself recommending to people who are starting grad school in emergency management or are doing disaster research at a graduate level. There's definitely a ton more books that you should be reading or maybe interested in, but those are some to start with. I have noted all the books that I mentioned below, so you can go check them out if you are interested.